Filmmaker Ken Burns says the 13 colonies uniting in rebellion to win their independence from England might be the most important moment in world history since the birth of Christ. So it should come as little surprise the latest documentary from Burns is called The American Revolution. The 6-part series begins Sunday night at 7 and continues each night through next Friday on Houston Public Media TV8 and other PBS stations nationwide. Burns visited with me here at Houston Public Media earlier this year to talk about the series and why he believes America breaking from England was so pivotal in human history. Ken Burns, welcome.
Thank you.
I kind of want to begin with how you came around to the decision to devote, let's face it, what is probably going to be a lot of time and energy, a lot of focus on the American Revolution. You could have picked any topic probably to do your next film on. Why that?
Well, we sort of realized that if we were given 1,000 years to live, we wouldn't run out of any topics in American history. A lot of it is a terrible thing about human experience, which is you learn a lot from wars, and we did in the Civil War and sort of vowed we're going to leave that alone for a while. Eventually got drawn into doing the Second World War, and before the ink was dry on that in 2006, we committed to doing something on the Vietnam War that came out in 2017. But before the ink was dry on that, in December of 2015, Barack Obama still had 13 months in his presidency. I just said we're doing the revolution. And it was a gut feeling. There's no calculus. There's no focus groups. You do it because you want to be drawn. And I think having done these major wars, the most important war, the Civil War, and then the 20th century wars, which we accept the violence of and realize how protected the revolution is, mainly because we don't have photographs, we don't have newsreels. We are afraid, I think, that the big ideas would be diminished. I realized we had to figure out a way to tell this story as completely as we were able to tell the Civil War or, say, World War II.
I would imagine one of the big challenges was figuring out how to structure it and how far back do you go to start the story?
Yeah, well, I was about to say the structuring is easy. It's chronology. You know, Shelby Foote, when I was working on the Civil War, told me God is the greatest dramatist, which means and then,
right.
and then. And that's how you tell a history. But you're absolutely right. When you begin is super, super important. And we actually sort of back up to 21 years before the revolution happens, to around 1754, when the beginning of the French and Indian War, what we call the French and Indian War, is a global war that's called the 7 Years' War, that Britain will be victorious in with the help in North America of colonists, including George Washington, who may have shot the first shot of that war, and also the time when Benjamin Franklin is looking as a postmaster. He alone knows everybody. These are really 13 distinct places that are as different from each other as night from day, and they don't know each other, but he's been the postmaster, and so he's traveled them. And he's also studied Native American societies, the nations that are bordering the western part of the colonies, and seen that they've had confederations, democracies that they've set up that have worked and functioned for decades. And so he gets the idea that maybe we can try this. Nobody anywhere thinks it's a good idea. But he'd drawn a cartoon of a snake called Join or Die over the dire warning, Join or Die, and then it becomes the rallying cry 20 years later when the revolution actually happens. And so we back up there and try to figure out who these people are, 3,000 miles away from the mother country, more literate than people in the mother country, owning land, which most people in the mother country didn't have, having a degree of independence and love of that independence that is going to inculcate some of the things that are going to unite these disparate colonies in an effort to throw off the British monarchy.
There are all sorts of ways that the story of the American Revolution has been told in the past, nonfiction and fiction alike. How much attention did you pay to the idea of let's find a way to approach this that's different from what's been told before?
We never do that. We just want to find out what's going on. Obviously, fiction takes liberties. We are not permitted to do that. obviously, for so much of the way we've told the revolution, even in history classes, it's been informed by mythology, by just a simple top-down narrative that is the story, particularly in the revolution, of great men, capital G, capital M. And that's not how it happened. There are women that are at the edges, children at the edges of all the battles that are following them around. There's a dynamic within the American society of the native peoples who live and coexist with the colonists, and of the 500,000 people out of 2.5 million who are enslaved or are free blacks there. And then, of course, the native nations on the West who are significant states the way Virginia is a significant state. The Shawnees may be like Virginia, who are trading with the French, who are trading with the British, who've had for centuries relationships to a global economy. And those are not sort of taken into consideration. And we also don't go into detail, because of the absence of newsreels, of what actually takes place on the Lexington Green, at the North Bridge, at Breed's Hill, Bunker's Hill, at all of these various things. So when you come out of this, you'll know 40 battles, and you'll understand why they're different, and why we won and why we lost, and why we just survived with just, the best of luck, and what the great leadership was of George Washington that allowed it, even though he made some pretty dumb tactical decisions in several instances. Just his leadership alone, as many people say throughout the film, without him, there's no us. And that's a significant celebration. But along with him are lots of other people no one's heard about. At that time, 0.01% of the population had their picture painted. So that means everybody else is anonymous to history. So it's really hard without invention to make people up. But you can read church rolls, you can read enlistment rosters, you can read obituaries, you can read this and find through the footnotes that that person kept a diary or that person wrote letters. And all of a sudden you can film the letter, you can film the signature, you can see the places where they lived, and you can, if you have, as we have, not just a third-person narrator, but a chorus of voices reading literally hundreds of different voices read by the greatest actors of our time. I mean, we have a better cast than any Hollywood film ever. I mean, Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep and Samuel L. Jackson and Morgan Freeman and Damian Lewis and Sir Kenneth Branagh and Matthew Rhys and Claire Danes and Paul Giamatti and Mandy Patinkin. And I've gone through maybe a sixth of the people, all of whom you'd recognize. It's pretty exciting that off camera they can help breathe the necessary life into people that we may not be even able to show a portrait of them because of their station in life.
Could you maybe pick out one story, one figure, one example of someone's experience through the course of the American Revolution or their part within it that was something you did not know about?
We could spend a couple of hours doing that. This is all us not telling you, our audience, what you should know. It's us sharing with you our process of discovery. And so it's been, an amazing journey. We've been working on this for 9.5 years, and by the time it's out, it'll be almost 10 years. But John Greenwood is a 14-year-old kid in Boston. The British occupy Boston. They send some troops in to occupy the city as a police action, and he's a little boy transfixed by the Afro-Cuban bands that are playing fifes and drums. And so he wants to become a fifer, and by the time of Lexington conquered, he's up in what is now Portland, Maine, in an apprenticeship, but he hears what's happened, and he wants to get back to get to his parents who live in Boston, and he can't. And so he joins a militia at age 14 and serves for many years, finally goes home because he's just exhausted from fighting. He's still a teenager. And then later joins the privateers, the ships that are attacking British shipping and are really driving the British crazy. We think that we may have captured more than 2,000 British ships in the course of the Revolution. And then later on he becomes a dentist whose most famous client is, guess who?
George Washington.
Exactly. No wooden teeth mentioned in this series. So that's just one.
Yeah.
Hundreds of people.
There are certainly some obvious themes that must come up in all of your documentaries that surround wars. But I'm wondering if you also tie in baseball and jazz and all the others. Are there any unifying concepts, thoughts, things that, whether intentional or not, just kind of keep coming up?
So I think up until this film, I've always said that I've made the same film over and over again, asking one deceptively simple question: who are we? Who are the strange and complicated people who like to call themselves Americans? There are lots of other people who can lay claim to that, from the North Pole to the South Pole. And what does it tell us about not only where we've been, but where we are and where we're going? So this, and one of the impetuses, one of the big, strong reasons that you say yes to that gut thought about doing the American Revolution, is that it's going to not necessarily answer it, but it's going to go back and say, what was it that made this experiment so distinct? And it's obvious. Before the revolution, everybody lived under authoritarian rule. Afterwards, there were some very, very lucky people who were citizens with the enormous responsibility that the founders thought the citizens bore, to lead a more virtuous life, to be engaged in continuing education. To pursue happiness was not the pursuit of wealth and objects in a marketplace of things, but lifelong learning in a marketplace of ideas. That's what we do in public media, I hope, from cradle to grave. And I think it was the American experience. They're always saying the word virtue. They've gone back into antiquity and plucked it out and said that. And there's worries and anxieties. John Adams he's a big worrier of the revolution, and he's worried that there's not enough virtue. There's too much ambition and avarice and too much greed for us to be able to start a republic. But you get it. Jefferson says a few lines later in the Declaration, after the famous second sentence that ends with pursuit of happiness, which we now know means lifelong learning. He says, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable. It means through all of human history, we just put up with this stuff, the tyrant's rule, and we're just not going to do it. But he's acknowledging that the human nature, the impulse, is to put up with it, and that somehow we have to swim upstream against this tide of human nature, to just sort of says, sure, what else can I do? My family's worked this land without owning it in Wales for 1,000 years. What's going to change? Well, 3,000 miles away, you've gone over there maybe as an indentured servant, maybe you just paid everything you had and you got there, and now you own a piece of land, or you've worked off your contract and you're able to get a piece of land, or you start a business, and you're really far away from the mother country. And until they start taxing you to help pay for the biggest empire on earth, which includes a good deal of North America, you're the most literate people on earth. You're the happiest people on earth. You're the healthiest people on earth. You've begun to incubate these extraordinary ideas that are perfectly of the moment of the Enlightenment, but also go back to some of the most ancient biblical and religious, spiritual, and classical texts and ideas that we have. And so we are the Enlightenment put into practice. That's what the Declaration does. It distills a century of Enlightenment thinking into one sentence, the second sentence of the Declaration. And it's the most consequential revolution in the history of the world, and it's one of the most important events ever. I've said that I think since the birth of Christ, the next most important thing has been the American Revolution.
To some, I suppose that breaking away from tyranny and pursuing happiness and all that you just described is obvious, and I suspect to some it's not so obvious that that's what we can and should be about. And
well, I think we don't think about it enough, right? I don't think we explore exactly who we are. It is that momentum of human nature is interested in superstitions and all of the things that people are susceptible to, conspiracies we call them today, but it's the same thing, superstitions. And what I think that the series has a chance to do, as I've said, is to put the us back in the U.S., to realize the extent to which our fortunes are very much tied up with the people back then, that we are very much like them. An incredibly divided time, horribly divided time, much worse. Patriots killing loyalists, loyalists killing patriots, just, very divisions. And a loyalist, we call balls and strikes in this film. The loyalist isn't a bad person. They're a conservative. They don't want to change things. Why would we change from the healthiest form of government that exists so far, the British constitutional monarchy? It's benevolent, the parliament, the king, all of this stuff. And there are these people arguing for more. And you realize you're opening the door to some really dangerous things. I think being educated allows people to see themselves. A good story is like a Trojan horse that you invite it in, and rather than opening up at night and slaughtering the city, it opens up and enlightens the city, enlightens the human being. And I think that's what good stories are able to do, and remind people that, as Benjamin Rush, who was one of the founders at the time, said, the American war is over, but the American Revolution is still going on.
You said you committed to this about a decade ago. What else have you committed to in the 10 years since? What's coming up?
We've released almost a film, I think. Yes, a film a year since the time we said yes to that. But we're working on a big series that I think Texans will be particularly interested in, that was sort of sponsored by our curiosity about him during the Vietnam War. So we're doing the history not of Lyndon Johnson's disastrous foreign policy, one of many presidents with disastrous foreign policies with regard to Vietnam, but his domestic agenda. So we're doing a film on LBJ and the Great Society. We just came from Austin and had a great time, seeing some of the folks who worked for President Johnson and his daughters and others that we've already interviewed and been working on for many years. We're doing a history of Reconstruction, one of the most misunderstood periods in American history. We've just got a lot of projects going and a lot of ideas for projects, but it's going to take that moment, just like with the revolution, where it isn't just a mental thing. It just drops down to your gut.
Is there a point at which you're going to say just personally, you know what, enough. I don't want to add any more to this list.
I work, one of my, we have a couple of, or three production teams, and one of them is my oldest daughter, Sarah, and we just finished Leonardo da Vinci that was out, and before that, Muhammad Ali, and before that, Jackie Robinson, and before that, the Central Park Five, and that's the team that's working on the Reconstruction and other projects that are going forward. I don't see that. I love my work, and as someone says, if you love your work, then you don't work a day in your life. And I work with extraordinary people. Sarah Botstein on this film has been, just invaluable as a producer. She's worked with me for 27 years or more, and so we've got a really good team of people who work really hard. And I don't know what keeps you younger than just sort of pursuing. Harry Truman said the only thing that's really new is the history you don't know. And I love that because it's true. We sort of see the past as fixed and our future as unknown. Our futures, I can probably tell more or less what you're going to do for the next 24 hours. And I'd be right. But I can't tell what you did the last 24 hours. And we have lots of periods in our history where new scholarship suddenly changes the dynamic of something. Think of Thomas Jefferson and DNA, how that's altered the course of how we receive the third president and the author of the Declaration of Independence in good and perhaps negative ways to some people. But all it does is add to our understanding of who he is. And so the farther away you get from a topic, you benefit from scholarship, you benefit from writers who have gone in, even dramatic things. My goodness, one of the great events of this new century, this quarter century, is Hamilton. It's beyond a play. It's a cultural event that has permeated. And what's it about? And kids are supposed to be disinterested in that. And you hear my grandkids and my youngest kids rapping at high speeds about, the Revolution and Schuyler, who's in it, and Hamilton, who's in it, and Burr, who's in it. And you just go, wow. This is great. If we can turn on people to just Alexander Hamilton, I think they'll find themselves ignited in a different way by the stories that are in the American Revolution.
Filmmaker Ken Burns, thank you very much.
Thank you.